Our conversation about limits continues from the last episode. This time, we take a look at how fear can keep us small and disconnected.
This is Jews Talk Racial Justice with April and Tracie,
a weekly show hosted by April Baskin and Tracie Guy-Decker.
In a complex world, change takes courage.
Wholehearted relationships can keep us accountable. One of the things that I'm thinking about that I think contributes and just problematizes and nuances the thing that you're talking about where people are resistant to change is fear. I think one of the, I think fear really leads us, and by us I mean human beings, at least the way I have been culturized, to look for a reason why the negative thing that's happening to someone is somehow deserved, right? Because if they deserved it, then it won't happen to me, right? If it's genuinely as arbitrary as it appears, then it might happen to me too. And that's like too terrifying to hold. You know, that's why, like, when I'm going to try and go with something that's not sort of politicized, but like, think about when a storm comes through and then people get trapped by a hurricane or whatever. And then you'll see on social media or just in conversation, like, oh, why didn't they leave? They should have left. Right. And somehow making that storm survivors trauma and harm like their own fault because they didn't leave, not recognizing that there are a host of reasons why someone might have been unable to leave. I mean, all kinds of reasons, like no access to transportation or, mobility issues, disability issues that allow, that made it impossible. There are lots and lots of reasons. In some cases, maybe the governor, you were following advice from someone who said, actually, don't go on the roads because the roads aren't safe. It's safer to stay in your homes. And then you get like, stuff happens. But the idea of that terrible, horrible, terrifying outcome could have happened to me is so hard to hold that the first impulse is, she must have deserved it.
For some folks,
she did something wrong.
For many folks.
Yeah, I think that it's an evolved person who has like had the time and space to sit with that. Like, it's
or who has gone through a number of those things themselves
on their own, exactly, and can
different things people say. I'm like, my family literally that we went through that, and that's not what happened. Like, so your little dumb narrative about how we could have avoided that doesn't apply.
Well, that's kind of how the privilege perpetuates itself, right? Like, I'm using this storm thing as an example because it doesn't have kind of the other things, but in that case, then as someone, if I'm live in an area that is not in Hurricane Alley, then that's actually sort of a privilege of mine right there to be like, well, if I were in that situation, I would have gotten out. Like, in the reality is that I'm never in that situation.
Right.
So I don't actually know what I would do if a hurricane were, a category 4 storm we're barreling toward Baltimore, because it almost never happens.
And to me, I think another theme that I'm seeing kind of emerge from this free-flowing, wonderful conversation we're having is also a capacity to navigate difficult emotion, right? So fear, but also upset. So that is a requisite for evolution and innovation, is noticing, I've seen this play out with rabbis at times in different ways around the subject of interfaith marriage, that some clergy, and this is not like, rabbis have a range of different views. Let me say that rabbis and cantors have a range of different views about this, but something that either publicly and often more in closed spaces, some clergy grapple with is, I actually changed my mind a few years back. And this is actually really, like, this is tough, in this specific case. And it's interesting as this relates to other practitioners. But I've been holding off on saying something publicly because for years or decades, I've said no to other couples. And in some cases, I might not even be able to reach them. And I'm having difficulty reconciling that and how to move forward, and so and that actually is pretty tough and different, right? But so there's also a thing around either, and people have different perspectives. Some say I still stand by those decisions, and some say I've learned more, and now if I could go back, I would have handled it differently. And I'm not fully sure of the outcome because I would have given them a couple different choices, and I don't know what they would have chosen in that scenario, but that's a lot to process. And I suspect in some areas, like in the field of medicine or certain things, some of these conversations, even just in the abstract, the prospect of having to reinterrogate years of tough decisions and choices that it's
a really good point, especially when we're talking about the medical field, because we're literally talking about life and death.
Right.
So, yeah.
And or the very, quality of life, or right. And so
that's heavy. It's,
and like, please, no, go ahead.
Well, I'm coming back to something you said a little while ago about, I don't remember what words you used, but it was something about sort of observing the situation, like, and I feel like that's actually, again, relevant in what you're talking about now, and if there's a way to kind of I don't want to use the word objective, because I think that word has really been misused by our society. But so it's not an objectivity that I'm looking for, but it is sort of like a wider lens.
Presence, lens, and being willing to keep an honest presence, right? Like that it's because people at times are not even like there's fear of, and part of it is around facing hard feelings, whether it's fear or regret or different things. But to me, it's basically like the simple and not so simple thing that people talk about with finance, of just because, you don't, if you made a bad purchase, like you don't need, both financially and or in terms of space, you don't need to keep that thing. Like you've already paid it. And so it's a sunk cost. And this is the kind of the case, but yet still, to me, actually, there's kind of an interesting corollary between clutter, like keeping clutter, and actually continuing to hoard, and some of these things on a structural level, because both involve deep terror and fear, or lack of developed capacity to be present with tough memories, with tough things, right? Because it both, like, there's both immense compassion that arises and also a sense of urgency around, and we don't want to continue. And now that we know, are there better ways that we can do this that set us all up for success? Not just the patients, or if we were to bring it back to race, not just the students or the community members, but the leaders as well.
Yeah.
Can we think about something that's great for all of us, and so
I love the financial metaphor. Shout out to my sister, Emily Guy Birkin. She's an amazing finance writer, and she talks a lot about the psychology of money. So that was like really resonating for me, and the ways that
please feel free to add more insight.
Well, I think you're exactly right. The money, I think traditional economists used to talk about us as actors as if we always made like the highest and best choice, but in an intellectual way, but money's very emotional for most people. So, and anyway, my sister has written about that to some extent. She's pretty awesome. Y'all should Google her, Emily Guy Birkin, no hyphen. Anyway, that just really resonated. And I'm going to be processing that for a little while yet, about the ways that sort of we can learn about the pattern of looking back on what we now maybe know or feel it was a bad decision, and the psychological
because some of that change means acknowledging that those were bad choices, but also that change can also mean moving into a different future.
I think I'm really going to think a lot about how we can learn from the patterns of behavior and thought around financial decisions
Mm-hmm.
and bad financial decisions in order to kind of think about how, and the interventions that my sister
Right.
and other finance writers have kind of talked about
Developed and championed,
to try and translate those, because I think there are some real parallels, and in many ways, because
Right.
sometimes the bad financial decisions are made because of moments of, you know, desperation or lack of resources or
Stress
scarcity or a
right.
sense of scarcity. And so I think it all, like,
or necessity even during a certain time, but then that becoming a pattern rather than that being an acute moment, and that becoming something that gets embedded rather than made it through that,
like
now we're going to reset.
Like
that doesn't make that bad.
Right. Here's another story. And then here's another story. You know, the story of the roast, right? Like, there's a woman
Story of the roast.
Yeah, the roast, the pot roast. So a woman's teaching her daughter to make a pot roast. They bring the piece of meat home from the store, and mom says, so first you cut the end off and you throw it away, and then you put it in the roasting pan and whatever. And the daughter says, why do you cut the end off? I don't know. We just always do it. And so then eventually, there's a much longer version of the story, but eventually the granddaughter goes to grandma and says, Grandma, mom always cuts the end of the pot roast off and throws it away. Why do we cut the pot roast off? And grandma says, oh, my roasting pan was too small for the full roast.
Right.
So, I mean, that's exactly the kind of decision you're talking about. It wasn't a bad decision to cut the end off because it wouldn't fit.
Contextual.
Right. But now that, you know, kid and grandkid have a bigger roasting pan and they're still throwing away a piece of meat. That's the kinds of
like
things where,
right. And part of it is social, just straight up social learning theory. And there's a way in different fields where it's both social learning theory, I think, at play. And also part of it might be arguably like unexamined honor that is actually worth revisiting, honor, and also an unwillingness to consider something else, and having an either or paradigm in place that says that I could honor these following previous physicians from whom I've learned and acknowledged that they were working in a different context or had these different things, and me moving forward and evolving doesn't inherently make them bad. It's just that now there's more room for the roast. There's more technology, there's different things. And I think, you know, to kind of drive us home, unless you have another insight, because we've had so many different things come up, but, you know, it just, I have feelings about this. I honestly should maybe take this to my healing practice, because I have a lot of feelings about this. But, you know, in this book, The Checklist Manifesto by Dr. Atul Gawande, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, it's fascinating to me, like, to kind of come full circle. I thought of mentioning this earlier, but then we really went in deep about these different third spaces and different options, because and part of me gets a little annoyed about this in different ways, about different elements that I see of patriarchy and dynamics around white supremacy culture that may be playing out in medicine or different features, but either way. But basically, he finds that by using a checklist globally in all different kinds of hospitals and in contexts, that the fatality and injury rate post-surgery drops dramatically. And it took a lot of effort to get people to adopt this thing for a number of these different reasons, because it could imply that they weren't great enough before, rather than saying, no, we understand you're fantastic, but you're also human. So this is just additional insight, right? And by bringing this in, we can dramatically save lives. And I continue to think about that, because I don't think everything is as simple as a checklist, but I honestly think, you know, especially after we just went through this really great learning program that you and I did together about thinking about how we structure joyous justice in our work together and our day-to-day lives. And it was fascinating to me to learn some of the sophisticated elements and also some of the solutions that were actually simpler.
Yeah,
were just profoundly simple. And so that's one thing that keeps me motivated in this work as we consider these different options. And if this resonates with any of you out there, of taking time to learn about some of these enduring adaptive challenges, and also noticing or being on the lookout for, is there a relatively simple solution or incremental shift here that may not be the full piece, but that could actually lead to enormous shifts or openings of new possibilities that make way for newer paradigms to come into being. So, and more just, I should specifically clarify, because new in and of itself, it doesn't really mean much to me. It's more about just and kind. So this is a fun journey. Thanks for joining us, friends. And thank you, Tracie, for going on that, initiating and going on that intellectual adventure together. Thanks for tuning in. Our show's theme music was composed by Elliot Hammer. You can find this track and other beats on Instagram at Elliot Hammer. If this episode resonated with you, please share it and subscribe. To join the conversation, visit JewsTalkRacialJustice.com, where you can send us a question or suggestion, access our show notes, and learn more about our team. Take care until next time, and stay humble and keep going.